Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And, today we're really stepping into some uncharted territory, at least for us. I think we're going to be talking about phase one safety trials.
Oh, very exciting.
Yeah, the very first time a new drug is tested in humans.
Right.
And we're going to be talking all about how these trials are designed to, really make sure that volunteer safety is the absolute top priority.
Yeah, safety first.
Yeah, so we're going to dig into things like dosing strategies, ethical considerations, and all those really strict regulations that govern this super critical stage of drug development.
Absolutely. I think, it's really fascinating because when people think about phase one trials, they think about, is it safe? But there's actually a lot more to it than that.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's not just about, is this drug going to hurt somebody? But really, how does it behave in the human body? How is it absorbed? How is it broken down? What happens to it?
Right.
The whole process.
So it's like a whole body experience for the drug.
Exactly. It's getting to know the drug really intimately.
That's a great way to put it. I think one of the things that always surprises people is that phase one trials often use healthy volunteers
Yes.
instead of patients.
That's very true.
Let's unpack that a little bit. Like, why healthy volunteers when we're talking about, say, a new cancer drug?
Right. Well, it might seem counterintuitive at first, but it's all about isolating the effects of the drug.
Yeah.
Imagine you're trying to listen to a really faint signal,
Okay.
and there's a lot of background noise going on.
Right.
It's really hard to make out what that signal is, so healthy volunteers are kind of like that quiet room. They provide a cleaner slate, so we can really see what the drug is doing without the added complexity of a pre-existing disease.
So you're saying like a healthy volunteer is almost like a baseline, like this is how the drug acts in a healthy person, and then from there you can kind of extrapolate.
Exactly. It's all about starting with a controlled environment.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But how do researchers figure out, what a safe dose is to start with?
That's a great question, and it's certainly not a guessing game.
Yeah, you can't just, pick a number out of a hat.
No, there's a lot of work that goes into it before we even get to that first human dose.
Okay.
So researchers use data from, preclinical studies, which are done in animals,
Right.
and they also use sophisticated computer modeling techniques
Wow.
to try to predict what a safe start dose would be.
So it's like a combination of really detailed science and then also, like you said, informed estimations.
Precisely. It's like taking a very calculated first step into uncharted territory.
I like that. I like that analogy. And
Right.
once you have that, that initial dose, then you go into what's called dose escalation, right?
Exactly, dose escalation. So it's a
Yeah.
very carefully controlled process where we gradually increase the dose that's given to small groups of volunteers, and we're looking for signs of any side effects.
So it's like slowly turning up the volume, just to see where things start to get a little bit too loud.
I like that analogy. Yeah, it's finding that sweet spot. The highest dose that we can give without causing unacceptable side effects.
And that's where we get to the maximum tolerated dose, the MTD.
Exactly. And that's one of the primary goals of a phase one trial. It helps inform dosing for later trials and ensures that, patients down the line aren't exposed to unnecessarily high doses.
So it's really like a safety measure.
Absolutely. Safety is paramount.
Absolutely. But how do we know? How do we ensure that the volunteers themselves are protected, ethically speaking?
Yeah, that's a really important consideration. And this is where informed consent comes in.
Okay.
Volunteers really need to fully understand the potential risks and benefits before they even think about participating.
And it's not just about, signing on the dotted line, right?
No, it's not about just checking a box. It's about a genuine conversation and understanding
Oh, wow.
between the researchers and the volunteers.
So it's a true dialogue back and forth.
Absolutely. Volunteers need to be able to ask questions,
Okay.
air their concerns, and just feel confident that they're making an informed choice.
Right. And that's where I think institutional review boards, the IRBs, come in, right?
Exactly.
I've heard that term before, but I'm not exactly sure what they do.
Yeah, so IRBs are like independent ethical watchdogs.
Okay.
They're there to protect the rights and well-being of the volunteers.
Got it.
So they carefully review the trial protocol, which is like the plan for the entire study,
Right.
and they make sure that it meets the highest ethical standards.
So they're kind of like a second set of eyes, making sure that everything is above board.
Exactly, and they have the authority to approve, modify, or even reject a trial protocol if they have concerns.
Oh, wow. So they have a lot of power.
They do, and it's a really important safeguard to make sure that research is conducted ethically.
That's great. That's really reassuring to know. And I think it's a good point to maybe dig into the trial protocol a little bit more, like what kind of information is actually in that document?
Yeah, so it's basically the instruction manual for the whole trial. It outlines everything from who can participate, like inclusion and exclusion criteria, to the dosing schedule, how we're going to monitor safety,
Right.
what we're measuring, which we call endpoints, and how we're going to analyze the data.
So it really is like a blueprint for the whole study, just laid out in a very meticulous way.
Exactly. It's all about consistency and minimizing risks.
And speaking of minimizing risks, you mentioned adaptive safety measures.
Yes.
In the intro, can you talk a little bit about how those work?
Sure. So imagine you're captaining a ship, through uncharted waters.
Okay.
You have a plan.
Right.
You have your charted course, but you also need to be prepared to adjust based on the weather, or maybe you hit some unexpected obstacles.
Right.
So adaptive safety measures are kind of like those course corrections in the trial.
Okay.
They're predefined rules that are built into the protocol that allow us to modify the trial based on new safety data.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So, for example, if we see a certain dose level is causing some unexpected side effects,
Right.
the protocol might say, okay, pause that dose level or even stop it completely.
So it's not just about rigidly following a plan. It's also about having that flexibility
Right, exactly.
to really respond to what the data is telling you.
Absolutely. We want to be responsive and ultimately keep our volunteers safe.
That makes a lot of sense. And it kind of makes me think about, who sets the standards for these trials? Who makes sure that everybody's playing by the rules?
Right. Well, that's where regulatory agencies come in. So in the U.S., we have the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration.
Right.
And internationally, we have the ICH, the International Council for Harmonization.
Got it.
And they set guidelines that are followed pretty much worldwide.
Wow.
For clinical trial conduct.
Okay.
And their main goals are to ensure safety,
Right.
scientific rigor, and that the data we're collecting is accurate.
So they're kind of overseeing this whole process of drug development
Hmm.
and making sure that it's done in a safe and ethical way.
Exactly. Their regulations cover everything from, trial design and data collection to reporting adverse events and protecting volunteer confidentiality.
It's amazing to me that, even before a drug reaches a human volunteer, there's this whole ecosystem already in play.
Oh, absolutely. There's so much that happens behind the scenes.
That's wild.
Before we even get to that first human dose.
And I know one of those things is non-clinical safety studies.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, so these are studies that are done in animals before any human testing can begin.
Wow. So even before a human is involved, you're already doing safety testing.
Yes. We want to gather as much information as we can to make sure it's safe to move into humans.
Right.
So these preclinical studies include things like toxicology studies. So we look at the effects of the drug on different organs.
Okay.
We do safety pharmacology studies to assess the effects of the drug on things like heart function and breathing.
Right.
And we do genotoxicity tests to make sure the drug doesn't damage DNA.
So you're really building up this foundation of safety data.
Exactly. It's like building a house.
Right.
You wouldn't build the roof before the foundation is solid.
Right. Right. That's a good analogy. It's incredible how much work goes into ensuring the safety of these trials. I think it really speaks to the commitment to protecting these volunteers.
It does, and I think it's important to acknowledge, their willingness to participate is essential for advancing medical research and bringing new therapies to those who need them.
Absolutely. And speaking of the volunteers, I think it would be really fascinating to dive into their motivations a little bit. Like, what makes someone sign up for a trial knowing that there could be risks and discomfort involved?
Yeah, that's a great question.
So I think that's what we'll talk about after a quick break.
Sounds good. Yeah, it really is a question that I think gets at the heart of the human spirit. Why would someone willingly subject themselves to, potential risks for the sake of science and the well-being of others?
Yeah, it's got to be altruism, right? This desire to help advance medicine and to contribute to something larger than themselves.
Altruism is definitely a huge factor for a lot of volunteers. They see it as a chance to, make a real difference, to potentially help future patients who might benefit from the drug being tested.
Yeah.
It's a very selfless motivation.
Yeah, it really is. It's inspiring to think that people are, willing to put themselves on the line like that. But let's be honest, there's also a financial incentive.
Right. Financial compensation is often provided to volunteers, and, these trials can be pretty time-consuming and demanding. They involve multiple visits, medical procedures, sometimes even overnight stays. So it's only fair to compensate people for their time and effort.
Right. And I think it's not just about the compensation itself. It's also acknowledging that, participating in a trial can sometimes mean, Travel expenses, lost wages, maybe childcare costs, things like that.
Absolutely, you're right. It's important to consider the whole picture, and for some volunteers, that financial compensation might be the deciding factor in their ability to participate.
Yeah. Right. So it's not always a black and white situation. It could
Mhm.
be a combination of altruism and these financial considerations.
Exactly. Each individual has their own unique set of motivations, and for some people, the financial aspect might be secondary to their desire to, really contribute to science.
Yeah.
And for others, it might be the primary driver, and, there's no judgment either way.
Yeah, it's just a reminder that, even within this really scientific setting, human behavior is really complex.
Absolutely. It's never straightforward.
Yeah. And I think, beyond altruism and financial incentives, there could be, other personal motivations at play.
Right. Some volunteers are just really curious about the research process.
Oh, interesting.
They want to understand how clinical trials work, how drugs are developed. They want to learn more about their own bodies,
Yeah.
maybe even be a part of cutting-edge medical advancements.
So they have this kind of desire to explore the unknown.
Right. They want to be on the frontier of discovery.
Yeah. I love that. And then I think for some people, it's even more personal.
Hmm.
If we're talking about trials for serious or life-threatening conditions,
Right.
Some volunteers might be hoping to access a potentially beneficial treatment earlier than they would otherwise,
Yeah.
even if it's still experimental.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and it's a difficult reality to acknowledge. These volunteers might be driven by hope or even a sense of desperation.
Right.
So it's crucial that they're fully informed about the potential risks and benefits, and that their expectations are managed realistically.
Right. And that kind of brings us back to informed consent, making sure that volunteers really understand what they're getting into, both the potential upsides and the potential downsides.
Absolutely. It's the foundation of ethical research.
Yeah. And it's a reminder that even within, this highly structured scientific process like a clinical trial, the human element is always there.
Always. And it's complex.
Yeah. Yeah. It's about understanding not just the science, but the people involved, their motivations, their hopes, their fears.
You said it perfectly. It's about seeing the whole person
Yeah.
and approaching their participation with sensitivity and respect.
Well said. So we've really gone deep today. We've explored the design of these phase 1 safety trials, from dose escalation and adaptive safety measures to the role of regulatory agencies and IRBs.
We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, and we've delved into the motivations of the volunteers themselves, recognizing that it's often a mix of altruism, financial considerations, scientific curiosity, and personal hopes.
And I think we've highlighted how important it is to consider the human element throughout the entire process.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm kind of curious about the emotional impact on the volunteers. What kind of support do they receive during the trial? How do they cope with, all the uncertainty and the potential risks?
Those are great questions, and I think, they deserve further exploration.
Yeah, I think it's an essential aspect of, doing research responsibly.
Absolutely. Ensuring the well-being of these volunteers, both physically and emotionally, has to be a top priority.
So how do we make sure they're supported?
Well, it all starts with communication.
It's about building a connection, right? Not just, seeing them as a subject in a study.
Exactly. It's about fostering trust, mutual respect. Researchers need to be approachable, willing to answer questions honestly, and address any concerns the volunteers have.
Yeah.
It really is a two-way street.
Yeah, so it's not just about, giving them information. It's about creating a space for dialogue.
Right. And, it goes beyond just the researchers. A lot of trial sites have, dedicated staff nurses, social workers, things like that,
Right.
who are trained to provide emotional support and guidance.
Oh, wow.
They're there to help the volunteers, navigate the challenges of the trial, cope with any anxiety or stress they might be feeling.
This is like a built-in support system, right?
Yeah, exactly. People they can turn to if they're feeling overwhelmed or, just need someone to talk to.
And I imagine, in some cases, support groups or peer networks could be really valuable too.
Oh, absolutely. Connecting with others who have gone through similar experiences, can create that sense of community and shared understanding.
Yeah, there's something so powerful about knowing you're not alone, right?
Exactly. And these support networks can provide practical advice, emotional support, and just a safe space to share their feelings and experiences without judgment.
It's so interesting to me how this aspect of support,
Hmm.
this human connection, can be just as important as the medical monitoring.
It really does highlight the importance of, treating volunteers as partners in the research process. Their contributions are invaluable, and their well-being should be a top priority.
So well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I just want to kind of circle back to what we've learned about designing these phase 1 safety trials.
Mm.
It's a meticulous process with safety at the forefront of every decision, but there's also this really profound human element that we can't overlook.
Right, from the rigorous protocols and oversight by regulatory agencies to, the careful selection of volunteers, the emphasis on informed consent, these trials are really designed to minimize risks and gather, solid safety data.
And we've seen how crucial it is to provide that ongoing support for the volunteers,
Yeah.
recognizing that, their participation is so much more than just taking a drug.
Absolutely. It's about acknowledging their courage, their commitment to advancing medical science, and just ensuring their well-being, throughout the entire process.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that progress in medicine isn't just about data and molecules. It's also about empathy and compassion and the incredible individuals who make these trials possible.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I feel like I've learned so much about phase 1 safety trials. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all of our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of phase 1 safety trials. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.